for a successful CCUS project. Before we start today's webinar, we'd like to ask a few questions about the demographics of the audience. So I'm going to launch the first polling question. And it's
Susan, I don't think we're seeing the right screen for you. Oh, okay, the poll question did come up. Sorry.
What is your primary discipline? We're starting to get a few responses now. Looks like we have a lot of geoscientists in the crowd. Votes are still coming in.
I'm not seeing 14 on the wheel here.
Okay, so most of you have voted, so I'll close this poll and share the results. We have 89% geoscience, 11% petroleum engineering. So let's hide that one, and I'll share the next polling questions. How many years of full-time experience do you have in the upstream oil and gas industry? The responses are coming in now. Looks like quite a few of you have over 30 years experience. Votes are still coming in. So I'll go ahead and close the poll, share the results. It looks like we have 10% with less than 1 year, 20% 1 to 10 years, 40% 11 to 20 years, and 30% have over 30 years of experience. So now I'm going to try to share my slides. Let's see, Mary, can you tell me if you can see the slides?
Yep, just popped up.
Perfect. So today's talk is what reservoir and geomechanical properties are needed for a successful CCUS project. Bob Barbet is our speaker, and Bob has over 40 years of experience in the petroleum industry. He's worked in both conventionals and unconventionals and projects around the world, and is an authority on refracturing rock mechanics and practices. He's delivered talks at various conferences around the world. He has quite a bit of experience in the Permian Basin and the Eagle Ford. So Bob is teaching a class next week in SCA's office on best practices for new well fracs and legacy well refracs. That's May 21st through 20th through 21st in SCA's office in Houston. The class that relates to today's webinar is scheduled for July. It's entitled Open Hole and Cased Hole Petrophysical Inputs for Carbon Capture Projects, and that's July 15th, 16th in Houston, Texas. We have free webinars that are scheduled in a series. This is one of them. So in June, we have Dr. Rajan Chochki scheduled to speak on Production Data Needs Tender Loving Care 2. In August, we have Dr. Salim Shaker. He's scheduled to talk about subsurface compartmentalization, hydrocarbon trapping, and CO2 sequestration. And in September, Dr. Dennis Drea will be speaking on getting it right with fiber optics, from monitoring frac growth to managing well integrity. We also offer live online classes. Steve Songenberg will be teaching on carbon capture, utilization, and storage, a geological perspective. That's in the mornings during the first week of June, June 3rd through 6th. Dr. Nathan Meehan will be speaking on energy transition for energy professionals. Also in the mornings, 2 time periods in sequence in July 10th through 12th and 15th through 17th. And Dr. John Lee teaches mornings in July on production forecasting for low perm reservoirs and PRMS and SEC reserves and resource regulations. That is the last week of July into August. And of course, live in-person classes can be taught in-house at your own location as a private course, or you can attend one of the public courses that we frequently offer in our office. And then they're also available live online, which can work great if you have students in different locations. So think of SCA not only for training, but for consulting and recruiting services. And there's some information about how to contact us. So I'm going to hand over the presentation rights to Bob. Bob, you should receive a request to share your screen.
Okay. Let's see here. Everybody see it okay?
Yes, we do.
You could turn your camera on if you wish.
Oh, is it on? Thought it was
Not yet.
on. Where is it? I'm trying to see. Camera.
It's
don't
just
see it.
below that little microphone button up on your dashboard.
Oh, yeah. Is it on?
There it
Okay.
is.
Yes.
Sorry about
You're
that.
good.
I was,
Good to
wasn't
go.
trying to hide. Let me minimize that. Okay. Minimize that. Okay. All right. I guess I don't know where people are calling in from, so I guess say good day as they do in Australia. East Coast, West Coast, it's different, right? But we'll talk a little bit about a course we got coming up here in July. What reservoir and geomechanical properties are needed for a successful CCUS project? You know, is a hot topic. I was real impressed with the velocity that this whole topic has taken on with the last CCUS conference they had here in Houston. It's a lot of enthusiasm in this, and a lot of people talking about it. We're going to get a few more Class 6s approved. You know, it might be even better if we have a lot of projects to talk about. I guess it's almost like when the horizontal wells came out, there were more papers on horizontal wells than there were actually horizontal wells. I think it's probably a similar deal. I think we have what two Class 6 approved so far. But you know, with the states getting primacy, though, that should help. Hopefully the state governments are a little bit more flexible than the EPA is. But anyway, we can only hope, right? And also, you know, we're not talking just about Class 6. You know, we're talking about Class 2 as well. I mean, that's probably, you know, where you actually get some economic, you know, results from your EOR type things. And this we talk about that in this course as well. So I mean, it's not just Class 6, which is really a fairly small population right now as far as total. Again, I believe the last count I heard is somewhere in the 30s, and we talk a little bit about carbonates in the talk just to be complete, but I also understand, I think out of the 30 some Class 6 they're going right now, or I think there's only one or two that are carbonates at that. Most of them are in clastic environments. So, but we'll cover both in the class. A little bit about my background, again, not really to brag. It's more like I'm applying for a job here. I'll just kind of give you some idea. Know what I'm talking about here. Again, I've been a DL in the past with SPE back in 95, 96, and it was one of the first ones out there. Just by accident, I stumbled into fracturing when I was in wireline, and just because I'd been on a frac job, and I was then, since I'd actually seen a frac job, and I was the wireline domain champion for the frac height log, they made me the North American domain champion for integrating fracs and wireline. It was just kind of more by accident than anything else. I just happened to pick that topic, and they came out with a product. So I can't claim to have done that on my own, but I got a lot of help. I did a little bit of work for BP on rock properties. It was an interesting trial of a difference between 4 microsips and 10 microsips. Basically, Obama's group was saying 10 microsips. We were saying 4 microsips with $6 billion in damages. So it's pretty exciting. Of course, I didn't charge enough when I saw what the other guys were getting, but that's always the case on these expert witness deals. Very interesting deal. Got the Regional Formation Evaluation Award from SPE. Again, that's Permian Basin, one of the more active areas in the country, which is pretty good. We did some innovative stuff there with petrophysics and the like. Again, I've had 6 articles in the last 2 years published, so at least getting more and more notorious every month. And most recent one was in the JPT this month, and the guest editorial that Trent Jacobs puts together had me talk a little bit about the refrac world. And again, I was nominated for this year's program. I didn't make the second cut, though. I guess something about organic shales only being a small portion of the membership now. I guess that's my story, and sticking to it. It could have been just wasn't as good as the other ones, but at any rate, it was an honor just to be nominated for that. I've got papers coming up now. You know, a lot of teachers, you know, on these classes, you know, have done this for a long time, but again, this hopefully shows you that I'm staying current in the field. I've got one coming at ERTech and also one at the ATCE on 2 different topics this year. So I'm reasonably proficient in most areas of formation evaluation, reservoir engineering, and rock mechanics. You know, I make that statement, you know, most areas. They would say all areas, but knowledge of what you don't know is equally important. And I learned that early on. They taught you back at the boat school that, you have 3 acceptable responses, yes, sir, no, sir, and I'll find out, sir. So in that business, guessing is heavily frowned upon because the consequences are pretty severe. But then again, in my classes, I make a point of, making open, encouraging questions, openly encouraging discussion. If I don't know the answer, I'll find out. I'll try to find out, or anyway, get back to you at some point if it's an involved question. But I want to make sure that you get what you want. And we try to focus all these classes on customer needs. Every single one of them I teach, we always go out ahead of time and ask for send a questionnaire out about what you're working on now. If you have any case studies from your area, if you got logs that you're working on or an area you're working on, we are more than glad to include that in the class if it's acceptable or if it's releasable from your company. In the end, that's part of the deal. I think that, if you've got something you can take back to your job right away and use, it's nice to discuss theory and showing you Gulf Coast examples and, things like that. But, if you're working the Rockies and the classes, I've been in classes where they have all from one area and really not any from the area you're working in. We try to keep it as customized as we can and do case studies on these things. So anyway, and also, in some of these case studies are consulting opportunities, and I do like to eat. So anyway, but that's a little bit about me. Hopefully I've got some credibility in this field. Some of the other courses, they've already mentioned this. We do a 5-day entry-level open hole log course, part of the SCA boot camp. We do a case toll and production log interpretation. I've had the honor of taking over Jim Smolin's course, which he's taught for probably 20, 25 years or so, I think. Very successful course. He wrote the book on this, and we basically teach from the book. And then also this new one I'm teaching next week on best practices for new well fracs and legacy reef fracs, which includes a lot of material that we're covering here. All 3 of them do. And basically, this course is a composite of all 3 of those, are the pieces of those 3 courses that apply to CCUS. Basically the formation evaluation, open hole and case toll, rock mechanics and reservoir engineering are all important, well testing and the like. So we basically are pulling the tidbits out of these 3 courses and putting it into a course that is specific to CCUS applications, both class 2 and class 6 type of wells. And what I've seen, I make it a habit when I start a new course of taking courses from competitors. I've gone to both CCUS courses at the Image and CCUS conference and with a similar topic, and they were good courses, but again, they were pretty narrowly focused. Most of them were just basic open hole logging concept and administrative issues on the state of the CCUS industry. Ours have got a little broader focus, primarily because that's where our courses go. We don't just teach open hole logs, we teach case toll logs. We also teach production logs, and also how to design fracs and test wells to see what kind of frac is needed and evaluate performance. The big part of our refrac course and new well frac course is, how are you doing? What's your recovery factor when you do your certain completion types, and can you improve on that? And use recovery. We're really heavily into recovery factors as far as the metric. In fact, the paper I'm presenting at ERTEC next month is looking at recovery factors of brand new wells, about 300 brand new wells that are supposedly state of the art. Basically, what we're showing is that you've got about a 60% cluster efficiency on most of these brand new wells that supposedly have the newest and greatest pounds per foot and all that. Everybody says, oh, we're pumping all these pounds per foot. Well, it doesn't really matter what you're pumping if you're only going into 2/3 of your perf. So that's big, and it's also something that's very, very current in the industry. So let me try to get this thing to go here. Okay, some challenges we have in CCUS is, it's highly dependent on subsurface data, and often they're in areas where there's limited data availability. I mean, I did one in Indiana a while back, in an area where they've got some shallow production, which was good. So you had a lot of logs in the area, but the sand that we're going to be putting it in and the carbonate system that we're looking at was down below the well control. We had very little well control in that area, and a lot of times it's not current well control. Typically you've got a lot of well control where there's oil and gas production, but by and large, based on the papers I saw at the CCUS conference a couple of months ago, that's usually the operators, unless it's a class 2, where you're going to be doing, with the EOR twist to it, you're really going to be in areas where there's not much information. In fact, the one they they did present, I think it was actually only class 1 that's been approved, 6 have been approved, I think, the one in Alabama. They were actually between 3 big fields over there where they had, good well control to the west, good well control to the south. I think they might have some to the east as well. And so the geological data, as far as, the type of rocks, the type of reservoir quality, things like that, was pretty well established in the area. So you can kind of infer some of those properties, especially if you do your mapping and that stuff that Steve talks about in his class coming up next month. How to take, integrate geology into this, because, you're looking at these are really big areas that you're talking about. I mean, it's normally with a wellbore analysis, you're looking at, what's a 10,000-foot lateral going to do over 2 miles. Some of these plumes that you're talking about, you're going to be injecting into these things for years and years and years, and the number of years they're expected to stay in there is huge length of time. So you're looking at going over, hundreds of acres on these things, if not thousands of acres on some of these. And in which case, you've got to know what your geology is. Keep in mind, logs are only giving you an 8-inch picture. And if you only have a couple of them in the area, you better know your geology. You better know what type of depositional environment you're in. Again, most of these are clastics, so clastic deposition is probably much easier to characterize than carbonate. You're not really driven by diagenetics and diagenesis and the like. You're driven more by sand deposition patterns. So it's probably a little bit easier to do in sandstones than it is in carbonates, but nonetheless, you've got to bring geology into it, because you're covered a huge area with these projects. And the other thing about CCUS projects, they're often driven by the source location. I mean, they're putting them in next to power plants. Like the one I was working on was next to a Duke power plant, and basically that it's not driven by where the oil and gas production is. It's driven by where the CO2 is coming out of the plants or whatever. So, and they can only, they can probably truck it and look at Denbury and look at the stuff they were doing. In Kinder Morgan here, you can transport CO2 over hundreds of miles, but it's not cheap. And so it's usually better to try and get it within a reasonable proximity of the source. But the other thing about it is, which I didn't think about when I started getting into this, is, active unplugged wells. If you're in an area with active oil and gas activities, 2 actives in there, but anyway, you've got an issue of wellbore integrity, and you're putting a lot of carbon in the ground, CO2 in the ground, and you've got each one of these, if you have poor cement or whatever, as a conduit to the aquifers below the surface and the surface itself. So you've got some issues there. So it's actually preferred that you have a limited number of well control points in the area, which can typically be plugged completely once you get done, if you have to, they're active. And then the fewer penetrations, the better, because that gives you a lot better integrity as far as leak points. Each one of these wells can be a leak point. So, it's preferred to have a situation. And the one in Alabama I saw was pretty good. They had, each field around it had hundreds of wells, but they're up on the structure. But the injection target was in between, in the saddle between the structures. And you had a few wells that were there, more than likely, when they didn't have 3D seismic, they probably put it in there when they didn't really know what was going on. But nonetheless, it's the fewer the holes, actually, the better. So, you think you want a lot of well control to characterize the rock. Well, yeah, but you also want to try and minimize the probability of having any surprises. You don't want the CO2 to come up and contaminate the aquifers, and you certainly don't want it to come into the surface. So that's a consideration there that I hadn't considered. Again, prior to 3D seismic, there was a lot of wells drilled in non-productive areas. I forget the statistics in West Texas. I think they were playing that debris flow, that stuff Bud Brigham was playing, and stuff that BTA was playing over on the eastern shelf or eastern part of the Midland Basin, Glasscock, those stuff there. I forget who the other operators were, but basically the success rate once 3D came in went from like 1 in 10 to like better than 50%, if not higher than that. So once people started getting a better picture of the subsurface from the other indications, mostly seismic, a lot of these dry holes stopped being drilled. Well, the bad thing about that is, these are older wells that will have data. So, and a lot of times you've got to resort to different types of techniques to analyze the old wells. A lot of times you got to do a lot with a little bit of data. And that's one thing we do in this course. We do a lot of that at our rock properties course, and we also have an organic shale course that I didn't put up on the board, but we use that kind of an interesting story. When I was at the Bureau of Economic Geology, I was the chief petrophysicist there for several years, and we had a big project in Austria where we had, I think, 3 input curves. We were running an old Russian inverted lateral log. It was kind of a weird deal. They were still running them, which is kind of weird because when the Russians were there in '49, before the Austrians took the country back in '53, they ran these old inverted lateral logs, and they were really screwy tools. They had a lot of horns on them. They had a lot of environmental effects. But when the Austrians took over, they said, well, where do we complete these wells? They said, well, based on this log, it's here. Out of 1,600 wells, I think we had maybe a dozen triple combos. They were all running these old logs because they knew where the oil was from the old logs. But what we had to do was we had to do a reservoir characterization. So we hired a neural net expert that actually worked on neural nets in the interpretation group with George Coates and I think Stan Tanu and those guys back in the early 80s at Schlumberger. They were in the brain trust of Schlumberger. And he actually wrote the Schlumberger neural net. And we hired him and had him out at UT for almost a year on contract. And then he went to work for Petcom after he went there. And I was talking to Jeff Baldwin was his name, and talking with Jeff when he got Petcom, he said, hey, you still running the neural net? I says, oh no, this synthetic curve generator is even better than the neural net. Whoa, okay, that's great. And so I was showing it off in my classes because I've had Petcom since the early days of the DOS days. I was showing it off in one of my classes, and one of the students says, you know, you can do that in Excel. I go, oh, really? And he showed me in Excel in with the data option, you have to load the data pack for it, but it's a function in Excel. So we actually, in the organic shale class, we use that to generate a lot of curves. We'll generate Poisson's ratio from triple combos. We'll generate sonics from triple combos. I think I just used it in a project I'm doing in New Mexico where we had anhydrite in the rock and we had anhydrite and dolomite. We had basically 4 minerals in the triple combo. We weren't able to solve for the 4th mineral. We developed an empirical sonic from the triple combo with about a 90% correlation coefficient. And now we are able to characterize the anhydrite. So there's things you can do with that. So we teach that because, again, with these type of applications, you're trying to get a lot of data out of very little data. And it could be older data. You know, you might have 1 or 2 new wells somewhere in the area. And what you need to do is come up with models that can use the old wells. We did an entire project at UT when it was a Texaco field where we had basically an SP and a resistivity curve on about 100 wells in the Gulf out in South Marsh Island. And we had, I think, 2 or 3 triple combos, and most of those were, you know, old well X logs from the 70s and not very good. So we ended up using the SP and the resistivity curve, and we generated a porosity from the core ties with the V shale. We got a V shale from the SP. We had to put hydrocarbon effects on it and the like, but we were able to do that, and we came up with a complete volumetric analysis for basically 2 curves. And that's possible in these type of plays as well, particularly with the large percentage of these that are clastics. Now, you try to do that in carbonates, not so much, but clastic environments, particularly a lot of the stuff people are looking at now on the Gulf Coast, Miocene, Frio. I think Frio is probably one of the top ones people are looking at. Those are very amenable to this type of analysis where you can basically do a complete analysis of the well with just 2 curves. So at any rate, there's a lot on that one topic there. But again, you're not always going to have modern suites. We do have a section where we talk about and say, if you're going to drill a new well, this is what you need. And more importantly, I've seen so many projects where I'll ask for people to give me the data they have on it. And if it's a science well, they are running everything but the kitchen sink. I mean, whatever that service company has on its rack is in that hole. I mean, if you use the service companies to kind of guide your decision making, they're going to probably give you a little bit more than you really need. And a lot of stuff, like for instance, core-based mechanical properties, I have very little use for because, it's Humpty Dumpty idea, but I've seen so many people with core-based Young's modulus and Poissons, whereas the logs do a fine job of doing that. I mean, some more on the scale that you need anyway. But people waste thousands of dollars on that, not to bash the core industry, but core P&P, your porosity perm, the XRD and all that, that's extremely valuable. But a lot of the stuff there, for instance, you don't really need. Logs, expensive logs, for instance, if you have a dipole sonic, we can typically get up 90%, 85, 90% correlation coefficient with the Poisson's ratio and triple combos. You don't need them at every well. The spectral gamma rays, we do that. Pretty much sonics themselves, the delta T's, a lot of these logs that you can run, if you have 1 or 2 in an area in the same rock, you can get an empirical correlation using this Excel multiple regression routine that keeps you where you don't have to run the logs. Even with NMR, we do it with NMR as well. We got a BBI curve that we generate, You can generate a lot of information from a little bit on wells that don't have data, as long as you've got some calibration somewhere. So we talk about that. You know, what do you want? What kind of test do you want? What kind of wireline testers do you want? What kind of data do you want? Do you want to do defits? You know, basically we can come up with a program that if you don't, you know, going forward, if you want to plan a well for CCUS characterization, we'll tell you what we think as far as what you need. And like I say, more importantly, what you don't need. I mean, you don't need to waste a lot of money on logs that you can get from other sources, or you can get empirical correlations from other areas that are already running. Okay. And again, you know, you need to be familiar with techniques to interpret limited log suites, and a lot of this is you know, need to be familiar with how to do multiple regressions. I guess I say Jeff was his neural net was tremendously sophisticated, and we paid him a lot of money to run it. But he basically said this routine that you have available on the Excel right now is equivalent to the Schlumberger neural net system. So, you know, it's not a neural net. You know, it doesn't have any kind of learning capabilities, or any kind of some of the more advanced features, you know, the more AI type features. But it does a good job, and again, that's all he uses from there on. And I think he was telling me that not just because he worked at Petcom, but because it actually is true. I've noticed I'm getting a lot better results with that than I was ever before with other methods. Okay. Some of the challenges, case toll. You know, I mean, if you can still get back in, the biggest challenge on a lot of these is the old wells are there, but they're probably plugged. But you know, it's a lot of times it's just a lot of times some of these older wells. I mean, we had one in the field we operate out in West Texas where it was a 14,000 foot well, and I think they had 7 5/8 down to like 9,000 feet or something like that, and they had a single plug at the bottom. That was it. It's like, okay, you know, it was plugged back in the 70s, and back then, you know, the Railroad Commission was, you know, wasn't really as conscientious as they are now. I mean, right now that's a $150,000 plug-in job with, you know, about 10 plugs in it and all kinds of stuff going on. But some of these older wells that are there that are quote unquote P&A'd, you know, you can drill out a couple of plugs and you can get back into them again. And if that's the case, you've got a whole smorgasbord of analysis that you can run. You can take, especially with something like the Halliburton program, you know, they call it the Kai program. I've been thoroughly impressed with that. It's they can go in and take a pulse neutron. Again, you have to use the capture end in elastic, but you can take the pulse neutron data and generate a triple combo. And it's volumetrics on it in complex rocks are very good. I mean, I did one in the Wolf Camp in Reagan County where I just said, oh, let's play with it. It's probably not going to be any good. I had open hole log data all around it. And this is not simple stuff. This is not simple Frio sand and shale. You know, this is very complicated rock with about 12 different minerals in it. You know, the XRD looks like a dog's breakfast. And boom, they were within about 5% to 10% of the reserves I got on the offset wells. I mean, and they didn't do. I guarantee you, they didn't do the reserve calculations. It looked just like a triple combo, and they ran it with basically one log, you know, with the pulse neutron tool. These new pulse neutron arrays from all the service companies are fabulous. I mean, they can do all kinds of stuff that they couldn't do before. You know, they rolled the carbon oxygen and the Sigma tools together, and you know, basically they've got other features on there now that it's really, really good. I mean, I'm thoroughly impressed in that and what they can do now. So that's an option if you can get back in. And the other courses that I've been involved in didn't even mention that. I mentioned case tool logs. Again, you know, your integrity of the storage space needs to be evaluated. You know, you've got to get some idea, you know, of can you keep the stuff in the ground? You know, once you put it in there, the last thing you want to do is have it come out. So you're going to be putting it in there for a long period of time, you know, quite a few years. So, you know, basically your seal integrity is important. And we can estimate that from the rock properties, but then ideally in every case, you want to do defits. I mean, we did a big project in Canada. It wasn't CCUS, but we were going to be heating with electric heaters, a dolomite reservoir. And right on top of that, it was a Devonian carbonate. And we were going to be confining it with a Cretaceous shale. You know, I'm sure a lot of geoscientists here know that's quite a big time difference. That's what the glaciers did. Basically, you had Cretaceous sitting right on top of Devonian. But the Cretaceous shale was what was confining it. So we did a series of defits with shell on that. I engineered several of the successful ones, and we used it. And with that data, we showed that you had the closure stress that we had on the logs. You know, we calibrated that to the defit closure stress, and we were able to predict that we were going to be able to contain the process because the heating process does generate quite a bit of pressure. There's a lot of stuff in that, a lot of, it's basically a downhole refinery. The Shell electric heater system is a downhole refinery, and creates a lot of stuff that, you probably don't want floating around on the surface. So you want to make sure it's contained, but we successfully evaluated that with DFIS. It's the same thing for CCUS. And the second part too, and again, this typically if you've got penetrations in the area, you're going to want to plug them. I mean, you don't want to have loose wells floating around in your plume that aren't cemented completely up, aren't completely isolated, completely both the annulus and the cement inside. But it is an important part though to start with. You got to make sure the mechanical integrity is there. If you happen to have it, and particularly on the wells that if it's a well that you drill, say your science well, for instance, you've got a science well in the middle of the field, which you're probably going to end up plugging eventually, but it's not going to help you if you've got a cement annulus on the outside. I mean, you can plug it, but you don't plug the outside of the casing, you only plug the inside. So if you have a mechanical issue on the outside, some kind of flow path or whatever, you want to know that. Even if, and most of the time too, the other thing on this, you're going to have penetrations. Penetrations are going to have to be there because you have to have monitor wells at various distances to monitor the plume. So you're going to have wells that go through the aquifers down to where the plume is to monitor where the plume is going. And we'll talk about, how do you monitor that? What type of case tool tools, the pulse neutron and the like. What type of tools you need to run to evaluate it. Although probably what's going to happen on most of these monitor wells that they have within the plume, it's going to be fiber. I mean, I'm pretty sure that operators are not going to sit there. I mean, I think California requires you to run pulse neutrons periodically out there, but I think you could probably get around that with running fiber. You want something permanent because if something starts to break, you want to know where that plume is all the time. If it's getting out of control or leaving the pattern, going where you don't want to go. You need to know that sooner rather than later. So having a continuous monitoring of fiber is probably going to supersede a logging program. Although logs are still there, but on that you've got to know what the cement's. You've got to know you got good cement. We talk about that. We talk about the acoustic and the ultrasonic tools that are out there. Basically in as much detail as you need to know. Mainly on this stuff. We cover a lot of topics. You're going to need the idea is to be an educated consumer of the data. Know what's there. If you've got a program on a new well and it doesn't include, ultrasonic sonic evaluation, cement evaluation, you need to raise your hand and say, well, hey, what about this? Let the technical people that are setting up the program know it. So anyway, that's an important part. And again, that did not show up in any of the courses I took so far. So again, we talked about this already. Either multiple surveillance runs of pulse neutrons or fiber. Again, and then a lot of times you can get a lot of information. The pulse neutron logs can give you a lot of information when the legacy log suites have limited data, which is the case. In fact, I was trying to get some data back. I was talking to one individual out of West Texas, actually out of Midland now, that has made a habit. In fact, he just presented a paper at the Saga conference last week in Charleston on uses of basically, data usage outside the oil field, and this was a key part of that. He's gone around and mined a lot of these government depositories and government deals, and some of the operators have sold him some data sets, for DSTs and logs, and because your public data that you're looking at, you're looking at, Enverus has a really good set. IHS has a good set of public data, mainly well logs. MJ's got some TGS. There's a lot of sources. I belong to all the libraries in Texas, for instance, so. There's a lot of sources, but still there's a lot of data out there that is, especially in your areas outside the oil patch, where operators don't have active operations, where it's maybe old wildcats. There's a lot of data floating around out there that is not really in the public domain. And this guy, he's got a pretty good system going on that. Brian over there the name is Sabata McDowell, Brian McDowell, I think it is. Anyway, I was pretty impressed with his stuff, and I was trying to get some of his stuff to present here today, but I didn't hear back from him. But anyway, that's, there's a lot of activity in that respect, because I remember when I was doing the Indiana project, getting the data was hard. I mean, and some states are better than others. I mean, like North Dakota is fabulous. They're really good up there. Texas is pretty good. Louisiana is really good. New Mexico is pretty good. A lot of these states are very good as far as the data goes. University of Lands in Texas is phenomenal. You've got all kinds of data there. But, there's other parts of the country which don't have a lot of oil and gas activity that really aren't that conscientious about maintaining records. And again, it's, a lot of this CCUS stuff is driven by where the source is. And it's you've got a power plant, in Ohio, or a power plant, in Indiana or Illinois or whatever, Missouri. You've got to deal with what you got. So this is going to be an issue, and I think that's going to be a growth industry of this, getting data from these sources. I think Brian's got the right idea on that. So look forward to seeing this stuff. So learning outcomes, again, what reservoir and geomechanical properties are needed for both Class 6 and Class 2 injection permits, and Class 6 being, your saline aquifers, and Class 2 being your EOR into depleted hydrocarbon reservoirs. Again, what's your storage potential, what's your containment, where is your fresh water? And again, a lot of times you can get that just from the SP log. We spend a lot of time on RW from the SP. It's a magical measurement that a lot of people don't take advantage of. You know what your mud filtrate resistivity is, and the SP has got a distinctive character with respect to that. If you have the same salinity in the rock as you have in the wellbore, your SP will be a straight line. And you can see fresh water, you can see salt water, and you can get a reasonably good estimate of what the salinity is from that, which is important because you need to know where your aquifers are. A lot of times they know that already. I mean, a lot of times places, particularly in active oil and gas areas, you always have to set your surface pipe down below the fresh water, with a certain chloride percentage or count. But maybe not so much in some of these areas that don't have a lot of activity. It may not be that well known, whereas there's a lot of information on that. And the good news is the ES logs came out back in 1927. And the first SP was actually a run as an electrode for one of the normal tools they were running. And they saw some funny wiggles coming up. They saw some funny signals coming off of it, and they really didn't know what it was. And I mentioned that in one of my open hole log classes, and one of the old timers in there said, you realize that they didn't understand the physics of that until the 40s. They knew about the SP back in the 20s, but they weren't really sure what caused it. And then it was until the 1940s one of the more famous petrophysicists actually came up with the physics of that. Why you were, with the ion exchange and the like. So, but that was kind of interesting. I actually ran it for about 20 years without actually understanding what caused it. But they knew it, showed where the sands were and where the shales were, and they actually used it for porosity in a lot of cases. But then again, we've used it for porosity. We've used it to get V shale, and if you're in a sandstone without a lot of cementation material, you can get a pretty good relationship between V shale and effective porosity. But anyway, that's from a very simple log, and it's present. One thing, if you go to South Texas, for instance, and go through the log libraries, you typically have, if you have a log on a well, most of the time it's an SP induction, and they'll have triple combos, but they won't release it. You're only required to release one set of logs to the state, unless you're on university lands or some kind of state land thing, I think, as a requirement to release everything. But South Texas, what they'll release is the induction log in SP. So if you're doing Frio characterization down there on the Gulf Coast, I mean, 90% of your logs, 90% of your public data is going to be just the SP and ES. And that gives you a lot of information from that. You can get porosity, you can get water saturation, you can get your salinity, and the whole 9 yards. You can generate a complete suite of logs off of that. We've done that a number of times where just the SP induction log, you've been able to go and generate a full analysis suite with porosity and water saturation and net pay. Especially if you have core data, it's good. Or triple combo on a well in the area. What open hole and cased hole logs are available as inputs, what you need to have. Again, we talked about this already, how to use the Excel multiple regression tools. And it's an extremely powerful tool. Like I say, it saved my tail on this New Mexico project I'm working on. Because whenever you have basically a dolomitic reservoir, with a little bit of quartz, a little bit of silt, a little bit of limestone, and that hydrite, it really messes up your porosity measurements. You can't do a simple cross-plot porosity. It no longer works. So you can't use the chart book. Basically, you've got to use what we're using is the PowerLog StatMin program, which is similar to the ELAN or global analysis out there. It's a statistical multi-mineral model, matrix model to work with that. But one of the inputs we use is a sonic, and we have sonics on maybe 1 out of 50 wells. But I got a really good correlation coefficient with a coherent sonic. We always stress quality control when you use sonics. Do not use a sonic log as is. You always want to look and have the coherency curves and make sure that it's quality data, because it's garbage in, garbage out. And these dipole sonics, people don't realize in general that they're not 100% accurate. They are accurate where they're reading properly, but if you have an 8-foot array and 4 feet of that array is in a sand and 4 feet is in a shale, you're going to get a little spike on that well, which is going to show up as a frac barrier or a non-barrier, or whatever. It's not real, because what has to happen for data to be coherent, you have to have the same transit time between the receivers on all 8. So you really can't resolve anything less than an 8-foot bed. So it's 6 to 8 feet. So if you've got bed boundaries in there, you've got to, so if you're doing a correlation to a triple combo or any kind of deal, you want to go ahead and do the triple combo regression on just the coherent data. You ignore the incoherent data. In fact, when I do a rock properties for a 3D frac model, I do not use a measured dipole. I will take the measured dipole, do an empirical measurement with the correlation with a triple combo, and then basically from that go out and do the estimate of what the rock properties are. And it's actually better than the dipole, because your porosity logs typically have about a 2-foot resolution, and your sonic has got 6 to 8. So you nail down your relationship between the triple combo. Typically we use like grain density, PEF, maybe neutron. You use multiple inputs, sometimes conductivity. You keep adding curves to the multiple regression and see what it does to the correlation coefficient. If it keeps increasing it, then go ahead and keep adding them. But and you can overdetermine it at some point too. But if you got 10 curves in there, it's probably going to be overkill. But at any rate, and again, the more curves you have in there, the more damping any kind of errors in the tools is done. So anyway, we'll show you how to do that. That's a real important part of this class and my other classes as well. What field procedures can we use to confirm it? I mean, we want to be able to, especially with permeability, because permeability is very important. I mean, you got to come up with some kind of estimate of permeability. And one thing nice about sandstones is, most by and large, if you got primary porosity on these, even with secondary, I mean, the Wilcox in South Texas is one of our most famous examples, and most of that's secondary porosity. So we got pretty good correlations between well test KH and log derived KH. And we nailed a number of well tests down there when I was working down south. We had people hand us well tests, and I had one client hand me 6 well tests or five well tests and say, okay, tell me what the perm is. I gave him perms on all 5, and he says, well, these 2 aren't right. They don't agree with the well test. Okay, well, let's see the well test. The 3 we agreed with had, basically a nice pseudo-radial flow derivative. It went up as 1-to-1 wellbore storage, and you had your quarter slope, your half slope, and the light, and you went on from there. And then you had it was basically a textbook, radial flow analysis. The other 2 were barely out of wellbore storage, and some guy put a type curve on it. So yeah, you're not going to, if you got garbage in, it's garbage out. But that's important. We talked about that. We do some exercises where you have a well test KH and you have a log, and you want to tie those together. Wireline formation testers are really important. That's the first thing I look for when I go into an area, because we've seen when you do these log-derived permeability distributions where you have a well test calibration, that there's a really strong correlation between the drawdown permeability on the wireline testers, RFTs, MDT, XPT type tools, RDT, Halliburton's tool. Basically, you've got a really strong measurement there. Now they have a spherical buildup that's not so good, but I'm not sure what's going on with that. But simple drawdown perms are very good perms for calibrating your permeability on that. DFITs, we emphasize DFITs, diagnostic fracture injection tests. Those are highly recommended, particularly for cap rock integrity. But you can also use them for permeability in your zones, and you can also use them for pressures. I mean, it's a big thing in South Texas on some of these is what's the reservoir pressure? Because you try to, the Frio is all the rage right now, but once you get down below the overpressure, there's not a lot of space there to go inject. You can only go so high. So, I mean, that's the big problem. You're probably going to have a lot more class 2 opportunities down there than class 6, just because of the fact that it's overpressured. But you can verify that pressure with the DFIT. Also, step rate tests, try and see what your parting pressure is and the like. Just getting permeability from the fall off or step, the final shutdown on a step rate test, you can use that, analyze that in the well test program. Tie that back to logs and make sure it's, anything that you have that's on a log, you want to try and calibrate it. Core, you want to calibrate XRD or pulse neutron, or just a conventional, ECS type neutron, source neutron. Porosity, you want to make sure you've got good calibration to core. Porosity there. Water saturation, you want to have a good calibration to capillary pressures, although in these type of rocks, you may not always get that, because typically you have to have irreducible saturation to, on a log to, in a wellbore to have an oil production, and that's not always the case, unless you're doing a class 2 type analysis. But again, getting real measurements is important. And again, what can you do to predict storage capacity? How do you get effective porosity? How do you make sure it's right? And the like. what kind of calculations do you do to predict uplift if you're going to do a class 2, which is, depleted reservoir? You start putting CO2 in some of these old reservoirs, you're increasing the reservoir pressure, and you're also increasing the miscibility. I know you get, your primary recovery on these wells, if it's solution gas derived to start with, is 15%, and then you can get up to 40-50% recovery factor when you do CO2. So it's an area where you're not only doing some good for getting carbon put in the ground, but you're also doing some good for paying the bills. You can actually go in it. And I predicted you're probably going to have a lot more class 2s out there than you are in class 6, just because of the bureaucracy involved to start with, and also it's nice to have a little economic benefit to this. I mean, you are sequestering carbon, you are doing what you're supposed to be doing with the class 6, but you're also doing it for economic benefit as well, or it should pay for itself. So if it's done right, and we can tell you how to get that information. And then, what case total measurements, calculations, tests can be made to predict seal integrity, both cement evaluation and the like, and also we talked about defits already. Pipe evaluation, there's some really neat tools coming out now for pipe evaluation, dark vision tool, and EV also has a tool. They're phenomenal. They're pretty much standard practice now on organic shale refracts. We recommend you run a ultrasonic imaging tool on your wellbore before you run a liner. You'll measure twice, cut once. You want to spend that money up front, so it costs you, $50,000-$60,000 just to know whether a well is going to be, whether you can refract a well, whether you can get a liner in it. So rather than just try to stick something in the ground and hope for the best, and you've got a lot of diagnostic tools that can do that. And they've replaced them. In my case tool and production logging class, I've got 2 whole chapters now in that on wellbore integrity that are basically superseded by this imaging tool, where basically all the stuff, these older tools, the electromagnetic thickness and things like that, we've got them in the manual, in the book, but nobody runs them anymore because they're basically using the ultrasonic. The ultrasonic tools now, their sales pitch, it's kind of interesting. They show a picture from 1980s with a sonogram when I had my kids, and I could tell it's a kid, I think, or a big peanut. You really couldn't really see a lot of the features on your kid back in the 80s, because you had fairly low frequency sonic measurements on the ultrasonic. My grandson was born about a year ago, and we saw in the womb at about 7-8 months that he was going to look just like his daddy, and he came out looking just like his daddy. It was all full color, and you could see his facial features and the like. And so that's kind of the analog to what we're seeing on some of these scanning tools. It's phenomenal, some of the resolution you can get on these. I mean, you can read perforation diameter down to hundredths of an inch, and you can tell whether a perf's been eroded or not, for refract purposes. So if you see a perf that has no erosion on a refract, particularly in the Permian, where you don't have frac reorientation like you do in the Eagle Ford, you need to know what poles took the proppant to start with, because just skipping a proppant, skipping a zone because you think it's depleted, is not a good idea, because statistically 6 out of 10 of your 6 out of 10 of your clusters are taking the treatment to begin with. Unless you use what they call extreme limited entry, or XLE, you're going to get cluster efficiencies in the 50 to 60%. And that's what we're seeing on this paper I'm presenting next month at ERTEC. We looked at 3 major fields. One had 200 pound delta P, one had 500, one had 1,000, and the 200 pound was the 50% cluster efficiency. The 500 pound was 60%, and then the one with the 1,000 pounds was 70%. Well, even the best case, and we recommend 2,000, 3,000. That's why, because even at 1,000 pounds, you still have 30% of your reservoirs not being drained. But this, long story short, that's where these imaging tools come in, where you can go in and see where the original perfs were eroded. And if they're not eroded, you probably better stick another hole in there once you get the liner in there. You don't have to skip it. But if you did get erosion, you want to stay away from it, because the last thing you want to do is put fluid back into your well. I mean, these refracts now, again, kind of getting off the CCUS topic, but the refracts now, you can see my JPT article this month, the interview there. The big point I make there is we're not really refracking anymore. Refract is kind of a bad word. I mean, Barnett, they're doing some of that. BKV is doing some Barnett refracts. But by and large, we're not refracking anymore. We're recompleting zones that are virgin pressure. Because, you'll see virgin pressures on these refracts. You'll see B factors that are identical to the pre-refract B factor. And if you refract a well itself, it's not going to have the same B factor. You're going to have different B factors after the refract than you are before. So anyway, but that's probably way too much information to that one point. But anyway, and then last thing too is what case toll wireline and fiber optic case toll measurements can be made over time. I predict a lot of fiber is going to be in the ground on these projects. You probably have the full suite, the acoustic, definitely temperature for sure. possibly pressure, and then acoustic. You probably have all three being run, strain as well. So I mean, it's I think you're going to have a lot of fiber applications on this stuff. So which we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Yeah. Let's see what else I got here. Okay. Again, some more details on that course outline. Formation evaluation overview. Shell volumes, we talk about that, both in open hole and cased hole. Your basic petrophysics, we spend a lot of time on that. We're getting ready to do a course for one of the vendors that's doing a lot of these studies, and they're interested in getting everybody up to speed on the basics, and that's what the competing courses do as well. I mean, they spend a lot of time on how to get the storage capacity and what's going to work and what's not going to work. Porosity and lithology, and I wish I could spell there. I did that this morning. It should be a T in there, unlike the Skechers commercial. But at any rate, the prime properties, solidity. What's the solidity? We need to know that up and down. Where's the base of your aquifers? We talk about that. Resistivity, water saturation, open and cased hole. Primarily for your class 2s, your water saturation typically in your class 6 is going to be 100% because you're putting it in the saline aquifer. So at any rate, permeability calibrated well test. We spend time on that. We're kind of pioneers on that. A lot of people don't do that. A lot of times, though, a core perm regression on a log is completely useless. I mean, it gives you some directional idea that this is better than the other one, but you cannot use that for any kind of injectivity or any kind of productivity estimates for class 6 type things, or class 2 injectivity for class 6, or both really. You have to have a permeability that's tied back to your actual well test where you actually move the reservoir fluid. And people get confused on that all the time. They'll say, well, the perm is this. I say, well, the perm to what? I mean, you take a core out of the ground that has irreducible saturation and possibly hydrocarbons, and you completely strip all the fluids out of it. You resaturate it. I mean, then you look at it. You're getting a permeability to an unrealistic piece of rock. I mean, you have what we did at Shell, and this was from my mentor over there, Harold Vinegar. He came up with this idea that when you do an NMR experiment, the way to get your NMR T2 measurement to see what your irreducible water cutoff is you take your core, you strip all the fluids out with solvent, and then you saturate it with water, you put it in the NMR cell, and you see the total spectrum. Then you put it in a centrifuge and spin it down to irreducible saturation and shoot it again. And that T2 for that second time, which is typically around 33 milliseconds in sandstones offshore Louisiana, and different everywhere else I've seen. But basically, that number comes from the core. Well, what Harold says, well, why don't you just take that core and just leave the irreducible water in there, stick it back in the cell, and then pump deco in or pump oil through it. And then I've done that a number of times since then, and it's really nice. It gives you an effective permeability. Now, I don't think we can do net overburden on it, but it gives you an effective permeability to the hydrocarbon phase at irreducible conditions, because otherwise a core by itself is not going to help you. You can't do any kind of injectivity analysis from a core permeability. You got to correct it for net overburden. You got to correct it for rel perms. You've got issues that and also the core coming out of the ground. It's hard to say whether or not it was disturbed. It's why you don't like mechanical properties. And I'm not the only one saying this. I think Bob Marie has also brought this up before as well. You're doing mechanical properties on a core. Say you were in the Eagle Ford to 12,000 feet with maybe 9,000 pounds of closure stress. That rock is under tremendous stress. Well, you're taking it to zero. I mean, does the term Humpty Dumpty mean anything? I mean, you're taking that rock from highly stressed condition and bringing it up and saying, oh, wow, okay, what's the Poisson's ratio in Young's modulus? Well, when you bring it out and relax it like that, you get all these little micro cracks developing, and then you try to put it back together again, and you got hysteresis effects. It's really not a good idea. It's one of the few areas where the core measurements are not as good as the log measurements when you're doing rock mechanics from the core. And people always do it. I mean, I've seen hundreds of rock mechanics evaluations for Poissons and Youngs, and a lot of times it's good. But I had a kid one time in one of my lectures, and I said, well, don't use cores for rock properties. Use the logs and just make sure it's quality control. And he came up to me and says, oh, thank you. And I go, what's the matter? My boss has been on me for months to get the cores to match the logs, and I can only do it on a certain percentage. Some of them are still just aren't matching. And I said, well, yeah, because you're unless you could capture that rock at in situ conditions and bring it to the surface of in situ conditions and not cause it to relax and then basically expand and contract, you're not going to get an accurate rock property out of that. So that's one of the measurements we don't recommend getting necessarily when you do a core analysis. So again, well tested the best, and that's all go back to perm. Perm from core versus perm from test. We prefer tests. Perm thickness estimation, open hole and case toll. The H, we talk about the Stiles George method, come up with your net pay, which is if you have a sandstone that's fairly, say, maybe less than an order of magnitude between the same porosity, permeability, that's better than, say, a carbonate sometimes. Where Stiles George came from was Exxon back during the 70s, had the Thornton and Means and all those big fields out there. You try to do a porosity perm transform to see what your net pay is and what your cutoff is, and it's a shotgun. So what Lawrence Stiles came up with was a program or a routine where you get a bunch of core data and you say, okay, my permeability cutoff is, say, 0.1 millidarcies. How many samples are less than 0.1 millidarcies at 2% porosity or more than that? So you might have 10% of your samples over that cutoff at 2%. Well, now if you have 2% porosity, you have a 0.1 foot of pay. And it gives you an accurate distribution, statistically accurate distribution of your net pay throughout the field. It can't tell you exactly what the permeability. It's not going to tell you what the permeability of that 2% is. It's probably pretty low most of the time. But it's like the insurance industry. You can tell how many people are going to die, but you can't tell who. Same thing there. And if you got Bill Cobb is a big water flood guy, former SPE president, and I kind of take a cue from him. He uses Stiles George even in sandstones. So if you don't have basically a fairly tight linear relationship between porosity and perm, say you've got 5% porosity is either 1 millidarcy or 100 millidarcies, you need to use Stiles George because it's not, you can't just draw a line through the middle and say it's good. That's what the government was trying to do in the BP trial. The Macondo trial, they were just drawing a regression through the scatter with 3 orders of magnitude and say, see, it's 10 microsips, not so fast, guys. You got to do this a little more analytically. Well, same thing with porosity perm. So Stiles George is something we recommend to do that because it gives you more statistically accurate volumetrics. Again, so we talk about that. Again, I'm trying to move my thing out of the way here. Can't see the letters here. Yeah, EOR feasibility issues when estimating uplift, what type of saturations do you have, residual oil saturation. Rock mechanical properties, we talked about that a little bit, calibrated pump in tests. Cap rock integrity, similar to the number 9 here with defits, separate tests. And cement integrity, tubular integrity, monitoring infrastructure of fiber, and then basically what do you run and what don't you run, probably more importantly, because people have a tendency on these new wells to basically open up the pocketbook and run everything but the kitchen sink, and service companies are more than willing to help you out on that. Oh yeah, this much for this, do this, but do you really need it? And we can answer that question as well, because there are things being sold out there that you really don't need, or there's a lot of things being sold where you only need one. If you can do the regression program for a lot of these tools, like a dipole sonic, you only need one in the field. Why people run them on every well, I'm not really sure why, because really your data is better once you get a regression than it is from the actual tool. So at any rate, but hopefully that's helpful, give an overview of what we're doing here. Some details on the class. It's coming up July 15th and 16th this month here in Houston at the facility on the west side out there at Beltway 8 in Richmond. And there's some of the stuff that we've already talked about pretty much, but if you're interested, contact SCA or look us up on the website. And I think we got a couple minutes for questions here, I guess, or is that?
Yes, thanks, Bob. First question, aren't those rock mechanics measurements in the lab done under reservoir stress conditions?
Right. You always do triaxial, but the thing is, what happened to that rock from the time it came out of the formation? I mean, that's the thing. That you're altering the rock. You're going from 10,000 plus psi down to 0, and then you're putting it back. Like you're putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. Those little cracks may just go back just fine and not affect it. But I've seen some busts where it suggests that they aren't always. And I'd say I'm not the only one thinking this. Bob Burry's a fairly well-respected rock mechanics guy out of Denver, and he thinks the same way. He agrees with me on that the core measurements are not good for that type of stuff. I mean, they're not as real, not if the logs can do a good job. And the logs are fine if you use the coherence curves. You don't use coherence curves, you're kind of in bad shape. But if you can identify the quality data on the dipole with the coherence analysis, I would use the dipole over rock properties from the core.
And this is probably more of a comment than a question. Bob is correct about isolating and abandoning an annulus. I recently worked for a company whose practice was to cement all the strings to surface and essentially abandon the annulus from the start. I initially questioned the practice, but when you consider the various intervals that might need abandonment, covering them with cement from the get-go made sense. Maybe not economic sense, but from an integrity perspective, perhaps. Any comment?
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's a big problem out there. And a lot of times the older logs, a bigger problem, and sometimes if you run an older log, if you don't run the ultrasonic tools, or if you don't run a pressure pass on your CBLs, I've seen a lot of squeeze jobs that didn't work because all they have is a microannulus, and 90% of your wells have microannulus problems. So if you run a conventional BHC sonic or some of the older sonics, you might think you need a squeeze, you have poor integrity, whereas you might have perfectly good cement. You might have isolated channels and the like. So that's why the ultrasonics are much better than the sonic tools on that respect.
Right. I'd like to thank our audience for attending today's webinar. Later today, you'll receive a link to a recording of the webinar, an evaluation form, and a link to register for open hole and cased hole petrophysical inputs for carbon capture projects. That's scheduled for July 15-16 in SCA's Houston office. Thanks for joining us today. Goodbye.